So my name's Terry Highland. I'm Community Relations Specialist for the Visiting Nurse and Hospice for Vermont and New Hampshire. And in COVID times, it's hard for us to get out there and meet in person and bring these presentations out to the community. So today we're going to record one of my favorite presentations and one that I think is very important for Vermont and New Hampshire. And it's called Ticks Are Everywhere, Tips and Tricks for Avoiding Tick-Borne Illnesses. This is specifically applicable to Vermont and New Hampshire as we have really high incidences of tick-borne illness in both states. So buckle up, let's get ready, and hopefully we can learn a lot today. So ticks are what we're talking about. And in specific, we're going to focus a little bit on the deer tick. And that's this guy on the right side of your screen, and its Latin name is Ixodes scapularis. Also known as the black-legged tick, the deer tick is really common in Vermont and New Hampshire, and it's of particular concern because the deer tick is the only tick that we're going to speak of today which carries Lyme disease. So other human infections are listed there on the left. Some of the pathogens, I'll give you the scientific names. So Borrelia burgdorferi is Lyme disease, and that's because it was discovered by Willy Burgdorfer down in Connecticut years ago. Anaplasma phagocytophilium, anaplasmosis, also a bacterial infection, very common in pets and the elderly, and we'll get into that later. Babesiosis. This is a particularly nasty virus. It's a viral disease, and it is more southern in New England, but we are seeing cases happen in Vermont and New Hampshire now. And lastly, I wanted to mention flavivirus, which in ticks is known as the Powassan virus, but flavivirus is the same basic viral strand that gives you triple E and West Nile in mosquitoes. It's particularly concerning because it's a hard one to treat and it's pretty dangerous. So those are what we're going to cover today, and we'll get right into it. So when it comes time to identifying ticks, it's really important that we know what sort of ticks we're looking at because like I just mentioned, not every tick carries the same diseases. In this case, the deer tick or black-legged tick, which is shown on the screen here, is the only one in New England that carries Lyme disease. So ticks go through various stages of their life. Just like any animal, they grow. So on the far left top, we're going to start with larva. Then you see the tick right below that molting into a nymph. And then in the middle of the screen, you have an adult male, and on the right, an adult female. And those are really easily identifiable because of that red abdomen. On this slide, we get to see what some of the other ticks that you might find in New Hampshire look like. So on top is the black-legged tick that we talked about already. And then in the middle, there's the Lone Star tick. And at the bottom is the dog tick. Now, the two most common ones are really that black-legged tick on top and the dog tick on the bottom. The dog tick is quite a lot larger, which makes it easy to identify. And also, it has pretty distinct markings on its back, both male and female. You can see the big differences there between that and the black-legged tick. It's unlikely you're going to run into a Lone Star tick, though they have been seen in New England. One other key thing about this slide, which is really nice, is look at the size here. And this is a theme that I'm going to talk about a lot during this presentation, is how small ticks really are. In the top right, you see a US dime. And those black-legged ticks are just so tiny. And that is a key thing about ticks, how hard they are to see on our bodies. So let's talk a little bit about the life cycle that ticks go through. There's a lot of information on this slide, but we're going to start and move left to right. So on the left, we're going to talk about their life cycle in terms of hosts. So based on where that tick is in its life cycle, it's going to be feeding on different mammalian hosts. So a larva, for example, is very, very small, not very strong. So it's going to be feeding on those really small mammals, rodents, mice, for example. And that's why the mouse is the biggest one you see there, where it says host number 1. As the circle continues around clockwise, and that larva molts into a nymph, it's going to start to feed on slightly larger mammals. We're talking rabbits and squirrels. And not always mammals. Birds are in there as well, some fowl like pheasants, crows, for example. And moving on, that nymph molts into an adult. It'll be able to get on much larger mammals. It needs more blood to feed. Then you're seeing things like deer. Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is humans have a really good way of inserting themselves everywhere in that life cycle. So whether it's a nymph, whether it's larva, an adult, we can get ticks on us at any point in their life cycle because we insert ourselves into their environment. So on the right side of the screen, we're looking at their life cycle in a seasonal manner. So in the spring, you have tick eggs, and those eggs are hatching into larvae throughout late spring into summer. Those larvae are feeding, and they're continuing feeding right through fall, and they lie dormant in the winter, and that's when they're molting into a nymph. And that nymph continues to feed and grow and molt in the late summer into fall into an adult. At this point, they've mated. They will again keep feeding, and they will then lay semi-dormant through the winter and lay their eggs in the spring, restarting the cycle. Again, humans insert themselves in every piece of this puzzle. And even though you don't see ticks in this diagram as being active in winter, they can be, especially in those warm winters when there's not a lot of snow cover. So where are these tick-borne illnesses occurring? This map is a lot of information, and I get that, but I think it's important to see how stressed the New England population is when it comes to tick-borne illness. Really, this is something that is limited to the Northeast when it comes to severity. So the ones we're going to focus on, the colors on this map, are purple for Lyme disease, yellow for babesiosis, green for anaplasmosis. So you see in the Northeast, Lyme disease is rampant. Everywhere except the far northern parts of Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Lyme disease is there. And then overlaid on top, you see green anaplasmosis and yellow babesiosis. Babesiosis is moving north, but you see how strong it is down on the Cape, Rhode Island, those places. The key thing about this map that I want people to take away is that if you're summering down on the Cape, for example, you're in no less danger of tick-borne illness than you would be if you were staying in central Vermont. All of the diseases are there, all of the types of ticks are there, and you are at just as much risk in pretty much all of the Northeast as you are in any other part of the Northeast. If we look at Vermont specifically, you'll see that the incidences are in the southern counties, and that makes sense, but this line is shifting northward. So that means ticks are more active for more of the year as we go north into what are traditionally colder climates. And this is probably due to climate change. We see these incidences per 100,000 people really, really bad down in the southwest part of the state. And then central Vermont is pretty bad as well. Not so bad in the Northeast Kingdom, but they're there. So when it comes to Lyme disease in specifics, we want to look at the demographics. Who is getting affected by Lyme disease? So this chart does a good job at illustrating that. We're looking at age here on the bottom axis. And on the vertical axis, we're looking at cases in the thousands. So you see a lot of Lyme in young kids. Then we see a small dip through adolescents, young adults. And then it starts to rise again in middle-aged, and those people are traditionally pretty highly effective. Not so much Lyme happening in seniors, which is surprising as we get on to the next one. When we look at anaplasmosis, it's a very different trend. So kids, not so much, not really a big issue with anaplasmosis, and the same thing for those young adults. But look at that senior age group, say 50 to 70 plus, much, much higher incidence of cases of anaplasmosis. And why is that? Well, anaplasmosis is not as noticeable as Lyme disease. A lot of these kids probably have had anaplasmosis, but never noticed it. And likewise, their parents' age, new parents in their 30s, wouldn't notice it. It's a fairly mild illness, but it can be much more troublesome for seniors. So that's why those cases are likely reported and then tracked. We have a similar trend line with babesiosis. Now, babesiosis, again, is unique. It's the only one that's viral on here that's common in New England. Again, it's really common down on the Cape, and we're seeing a lot of people in that senior age group affected by babesiosis. This is a chart is specific to Massachusetts, by the way. However, you can see it is rare because these are cases per 100,000 on that vertical axis. Now, what are ticks doing out there? What's their motivation? Why are ticks parasitic? Well, that's exactly what ticks are. They're parasitic arachnids. That doesn't mean they're spiders. It just means that they're eight-legged parasitic bugs, for lack of a better term. And that means that their meal is blood. They don't eat anything else. They're not omnivorous. They're not out there eating plants. They're purely using blood as their food source. So ticks know this, obviously, and they're out there questing. And that's what these images are illustrating. And the act of questing is just what it sounds like. They're reaching out with their front legs. They're trying to grab a mammal as it passes by. Again, like I said, size is really important here. Just look at how small these ticks are on the end of these branches or flower tips compared to a seed on that flower stalk. Really, really tiny. So it's so easy to miss a questing tick, say if you're hiking or even walking through your yard. You'll never see it. I know this slide is a little gross, but it's really important, again, to illustrate size and different things that ticks might be doing on your body. So on the top left, we're seeing an embedded tick. That's a tick that's gone down and dug into your skin a bit and is trying to feed. In the middle, we're seeing just a tick traveling, okay, but it's a great illustration of size. Okay, that is a nymph tick there, so it's not full size, but it's close. And look how tiny it is compared to a fingerprint. And on the far right, we see a tick that's engorged. That means it's a tick that's fully fed and has detached. Obviously, you can see that their abdomen has stretched significantly. Their appearance changes a lot, and that's because they're quite literally full of blood in that stage. Again, ticks are very small. And again, to illustrate size, I wanted to show this. This scale is in centimeters. So you're looking at 2 centimeters there in total. Okay, and on the far left, an adult female deer tick, an adult male moving right to a nymph, and then down to larva. So tiny. We're looking at less than a millimeter wide for larvae there. So really easy not to see these on your body. So what's the goal here? Why are we talking about ticks? Well, our goal is prevention. Okay, your number one armor in this scenario is frequent visual inspections to prevent tick-borne illness. So that means don't let those ticks be on you long enough that they can embed and bite into your skin. There's other ways to prevent ticks getting on your skin. Using protective clothing is really important. And what that means is long sleeves, tucking in pants to socks is a great way to keep those ticks outside of your clothing instead of, say, crawling up your leg. Wearing light-colored clothing is one that a lot of people don't consider, but there's 2 benefits to this. If you're wearing light-colored clothes and it's full length in the summer, you're going to be cooler than if you're wearing dark-colored clothes, so it'll make it more bearable for you. Also, it contrasts with the color of the tick. Ticks are pretty dark-colored, so if you're wearing something very light, you'll be able to see them easier. The last piece of advice is to avoid tick-infested areas. Now, unfortunately, that's not possible in Vermont and New Hampshire. There's no part of either state which is not defined by volume as infested. Moving on to some chemical prevention, I think this one's really important because it works so well. So one thing we know is that chemical repellents that contain 20 to 30% DEET work. Not only will they keep the ticks from coming on you in the first place, but if they do come into contact with that DEET, they will die. This is really, really effective at keeping those ticks off of your skin. One thing that I want to make clear here is you do not need tick-specific insect spray. The marketing has gotten clever, and they will charge up spray that specifically says tick on it. However, as long as it's 20-30% DEET, a traditional bug spray will work. You're going to apply this to your skin and your clothing, and something that's really key is reapplication every 45 minutes or so, or even sooner if you're doing labor and sweating. Other chemicals, permethrin. Some of you may have heard of this. It's something that goes on clothing, not on your skin. It does work really well, and you're needing to treat those clothes with something that contains at least 0.5% permethrin, and that repels and kills ticks even after you've washed those clothes. So that's a really good thing to do if you have a separate set of outdoor clothes. The next one I'm going to mention is Pure Solutions. This is a local company. They've actually started in Lyme, New Hampshire, and they're touting an organic property spray for your yard and garden areas. I don't have any data on how effective this is, but I did want to mention it just because it's out there and I have seen it being used in the Upper Valley. Canine tick collars, and I specifically mentioned Bear Serestro simply because it's waterproof, it has great reviews, and it seems to last a good long time, about 8 months on a dog. So if you're using this simply to wrap around the leg of your pants, down near your boots, a lot of loggers have taken to doing this. It's a great way to keep ticks from crawling up onto the rest of your body, and it can last a year or two, as long as you're not getting it too wet all the time. So what do you do if you find an embedded tick? Now, there's a lot of old wisdom about how to remove a tick. You may have heard that you need to put Vaseline on top of that tick and it'll back out because it's suffocating. You may have heard that you need to burn the end of it with a lighter. Both of these are myths. There's only one way that is proper to remove a tick, and that's simply using a pair of forceps, otherwise known as standard tweezers. You're going to get down near the base of that tick, as you can see on the left side of the screen, and you're going to pull straight upwards. Now, one thing that's key, if those mouth parts are left in your skin, that's okay. This is another piece of information that's spread over years and years. Do not dig in your skin to try and get those mouth parts out. You're more likely to cause an infection or some issue. Just wait, be patient, apply a topical antiseptic like Neosporin or Bactine, and eventually your skin will expel those mouth parts. At this point, you've already taken off the risk that you had from this tick of getting infected. The infectious agent is in the gut of the tick, and as soon as that's removed, the mouth parts can no longer transmit. They also die immediately. Something that's really key with ticks being on you, and this has to do with how likely you are to get infected, is time. Time is of the essence here, and you can tell how long a tick has been on you by looking at the engorgement. So an unfed tick on the far left, and then moving rightwards across the screen, we see one fully engorged. It takes about 4 days. This will be particularly important as I get into the next section because it takes a certain amount of time for infection to travel from that tick's gut into the host's bloodstream. So depending on the stage of engorgement, your chances of getting infection go exponentially up or exponentially down. So determining if you have a tick-borne illness. This slide focuses on Lyme disease. So some common symptoms are one that you've probably all heard about, erythema migrans. And what that is that traditional bullseye rash. And this usually doesn't appear to more than 3 days after that tick's been feeding on you. One thing I'll mention is it's not always a bullseye. We'll get into that just shortly. Other symptoms, fatigue, chills, fever, muscle and joint pain, headache, swollen lymph nodes. Now, those symptoms are pretty similar to anything that you might contract, cold or flu for that matter, which is unfortunate. However, ones that you really want to focus on are that rash and the partial facial paralysis in the bottom right there, otherwise known as Bell's palsy, where half your face is no longer responsive temporarily. That could definitely be an indicator of Lyme disease. It's quite common. Like I said, it's not always a bullseye rash. Okay, often it's not a traditional bullseye rash, but erythema migrans can present in all of these different ways here. So we see blistering, bubbling lesions, just a uniform red lesion, bluish red, sort of like a bruise, the bullseye, and disseminated lesions. And disseminated lesions can really spread away from that tick bite. So if your entire arm starts getting splotchy rash on it, you need to start looking for that tick bite. See if you were bitten by a tick. So remember how I said time was important? Specifically for Lyme disease, it really does matter how long that tick's been feeding on you, and that determines whether or not you're going to get Lyme disease or not. So this is straight out of infectious disease literature. It's universally agreed on, and these are the criteria in which case you might want to be treated. You likely have Lyme disease. I'm going to read it verbatim. The attached tick can be reliably identified as an adult or nymph Ixodes scapularis tick that is estimated to have been attached for at least 36 hours or more on the basis of the degree of engorgement with blood or on certainty about the time of exposure you've had to that tick. So what does that mean? Basically what this means is that tick hasn't been on you for more than 36 hours, there's a 99% chance you're not having Lyme disease. And that's because it takes that long for Lyme disease to transmit down from the tick's gut into your bloodstream. However, if you can prove, either by saving the tick and looking at engorgement, or you know for certain when you got that tick on you on a hike and you found it 36 hours later, you can be certain that you will be treated in this point. So what is the treatment? The treatment is prophylaxis. A single dose of doxycycline around 200 milligrams. Does this work? Absolutely, it works. 70 to 80% effective if those criteria mentioned were met. So there's some other criteria that needs to be had here, and again, it has to do with time. So that doxycycline treatment needs to be started within 72 hours of that tick being removed. You can't be pregnant, can't be a child, and the local rate of infection has to be greater than 20%, and that's the local rate of infection in these ticks. And yes, that is true for all of Vermont, New Hampshire, so that criteria will always be met. If it's been longer than 72 hours, can you still be treated for Lyme? Yes, absolutely you can. There's a few options, and the doctors are going to want to know if you have symptoms. But typically the treatment course is 14 days, but it can range longer, of antimicrobials. Those same ones that we mentioned. It could be doxycycline. If you're allergic to doxycycline or you have bad effects of that, amoxicillin, cefuroxime also work. So moving on to anaplasmosis. The symptoms are very similar to Lyme. However, rash is not a symptom of anaplasmosis. In the treatment, a lot of people do not need treatment for anaplasmosis. This is the least worrisome of the diseases for most age groups. Those at-risk populations of seniors, maybe with a pre-existing condition, might want to be a little more concerned, but most people might not even know they have anaplasmosis and won't require treatment to overcome it. However, the treatment is the same as Lyme. You're going to use doxycycline to overcome that illness. Now, what about babesiosis? Now, I mentioned before that this one's viral, so that makes it a little different for treating. It's also rare in Vermont. Like I said, it's more common on the Cape, down in southern New England. It can be a really dangerous illness. So the symptoms you want to look out for are summer flu, chills and fever. One thing that's unique to this, unlike those other diseases, is jaundice. Jaundice is the yellowing of the skin, yellowing of the eye. The treatment isn't always appropriate for babesiosis, and testing is required case by case, blood test. More complex treatments can be had in the really severe cases, but again, the treatments are so unique, we're not going to get into them today because it's very case by case and it depends on the individual patient and how that doctor wants to move forward with treatment. The last one we're going to mention today is Powassan virus. And we need to mention it because it is moving north. There's been cases, which is new. It's not something that has been common, but it needs to be noted now that ticks can carry this. So Powassan virus is a strain of the flavivirus. Like I mentioned in the very beginning, this is the same virus that can cause Triple E and West Nile that you see in mosquitoes. It's increased and it's moving north. We've seen it in the Great Lakes, and we've seen it typically happening in the fall in southern New England. Some scary things about Powassan is it transmits into the blood as few as 15 minutes of attachment. That's something that's very different than, say, Lyme disease, which takes up to 36 hours. So 15 minutes of that tick biting you, and you could be infected with Powassan. The good news is 1% of ticks are infected, which is very small, and there's only been one reported case in Vermont in over 20 years. The symptoms are sort of unique. Typically, you'll see a fever, which isn't so special, but memory loss and seizures are symptoms of this disease. Very unique. The bad news, again, when it comes to treatment, there's no vaccine for this virus, and there's no medicines that have effectively treated it in the past. So if your body doesn't overcome Powassan through your natural immune system, there's a good likeliness that this disease could be deadly. Now, I don't want to scare people too much. But the reason Powassan is on here and the reason I spend so much time talking about the bad news with this slide is because our goal is prevention. There's no better case for prevention than what I just described with Powassan virus. So again, prevent, 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 and this is how you can do it. Frequent visual inspections. That is your number one way of making sure that you don't get bitten. You go outside every 15, 20 minutes, take 2 minutes to look over your entire body. Go up and down your arms, up and down your legs, pull up your pants a bit, roll up your sleeves, check all of these areas and look for those ticks. Using protective clothing, tucking in those pants to socks like I mentioned. Wearing light colors, that'll work. Using a chemical insect repellent that contains 30% DEET or more is hugely effective. So do these things, keep those ticks off you, and limit your chances of getting any one of these diseases I just mentioned. That's the end of this presentation. And I'm sure you still have a lot of questions, and that's fine. Normally there'd be a Q&A section where I would sit with the audience and take questions individually. Since we can't do that today, I'm happy to take any questions that you all have. So my email's right there on the screen, and feel free to email me, thyland@vnhcare.org. I'll get back to you with answers, and hopefully we can keep you safe. And tick season is here. Let's not get infected. Thanks, everybody.